Did DNA prove the skeleton under the Leicester car park was Richard III? This is a re-recording, slightly modified, of a talk I gave at the Who Do You Think You Are live event in Birmingham on the 7th of April 2016. The British audience at that event didn't need much background on Richard III. There's been virtually saturation media coverage with the King in the car park, to the extent it's now part of popular culture. An indication of how much popular culture it is these cartoons. My favorite is the two parking attendants looking at the excavated grave. One says, "I say, Richard III's body is taking up 2 parking spaces." His colleague replies, "Indeed, his evil knows no bounds." What hasn't received as much attention is the detail of the evidence that led to the conclusion it was Richard, as published in an article in Nature Communications in December 2014. This is another case where the devil is in the detail. Statements such as these appear to leave no doubt that it was the DNA evidence that was crucial for the identification. But is that what the Nature article implies? The Richard III Society retained a local Leicester team to do the investigation. As a science graduate of the University of Leicester, I may be a bit biased. The capabilities of forensic science used by the university in the identification were amazing. But as a genealogist, I wondered if there are any lessons we can apply more broadly in genealogy, and all without digging up our ancestors. I'll explain the evidence elements and ask you to judge whether the case is proved that it's Richard as the evidence accumulates. Here's the background, very briefly. In 1485, King Richard III was killed at the Battle of Bosworth. Documents have him hastily buried in the choir of the medieval church of the Grey Friars in Leicester. Then, in 1538, came the dissolution of the monasteries by Henry VIII. There were stories about the fate of the king's remains. The land was sold off and reused. And then from the 1930s, part of the site was used as a car park. This is the New Street entrance to that car park from Google Street View. On the map, New Street runs south of the cathedral to the top left. The street named Greyfriars is a pretty good clue this is the right area. We're looking immediately down to the area where the skeleton was found. For the Richard III Society, the project was called Looking for Richard. The objective couldn't be clearer. Project champion Philippa Langley describes in her book The King's Grave her initial visit to the site in 2004 and getting goosebumps at a particular location. Then, returning a year later, the goosebumps recurred and she found a new white hand-painted letter R at the same location, denoting a reserved parking spot. But for her, that R had another significance. After years of delay and frustration, a dig got underway in 2012 using the professionals of the University of Leicester Archeological Services. Philippa Langley's goosebumps as evidence don't cut much ice with professional archaeologists. They saw lots of uncertainties. Where was the original burial location? How reliable were the reports? Had the body been disinterred? There was a story it had been thrown in the River Soar. Perhaps the body was destroyed during other building at the site. That very nearly happened. And then there was the possibility of confusion with other burials. Rhetorically, odds of 1 in a million were mentioned as the chance of finding Richard. A more careful but still skeptical evaluation had a 40-1 or about 2.5% chance that Richard's remains still lay there to be found. That's extremely to very improbable on a scale I'll be mentioning later. Let's turn to looking at the evidence from the dig. The first things discovered were leg bones close to where the R had been on the car park. They'd been buried for more than 500 years. You be the judge as to whether at this stage you're convinced beyond a reasonable doubt they belong to Richard III. I'll ask your judgment as other pieces of evidence accumulate. But here's some guidance for making your judgment. Only use your common sense and the evidence presented here so far. In particular, put out of your mind anything you've previously heard about the dig at Leicester. Judge whether it's proved or not yet proved that the skeleton is that of Richard III beyond reasonable doubt. Now, we all have a personal interpretation of reasonable doubt. In law, reasonable doubt is agreed to be better than 50-50 chance and less than perfect certainty. So, taking into account only the documentary evidence of Richard's burial, that there are records of other burials at the Greyfriars site, and Philippa Langley's goosebumps, if you like, is finding these leg bones in the Greyfriars area enough to convince you they belong to Richard beyond reasonable doubt? I have to say that when I've presented this before, very few people, maybe one or two, have raised their hands. The dig continued, and the archaeologists determined the skeleton was in the church choir. In the second week, they began uncovering the skeleton and removing the bones. That lasted 3 days and was mainly done by University of Leicester osteoarchaeologist Joe Appleby. The skeleton in situ was crammed into a grave which was too short. There was a curved spine and trauma to the skull. So, is finding a skeleton in the Greyfriars choir, and with the evidence observed at the site, but before the skeleton was removed for detailed examination, is that enough to convince you it's Richard III beyond reasonable doubt? As seen in the grave, the skeleton had a marked spinal deformity. Contemporary sources report Richard had one shoulder higher than the other, which didn't stop him wearing armor as a warrior king. Then there's Shakespeare's description of him as poisonous bunchback toad. Detailed examination of each of the vertebrae by Joe Appleby back at the university, in consultation with medical experts, revealed scoliosis, a curvature that had existed during life. It wasn't just an artifact of the placement of the skeleton in too short a grave. However, experts advised that 2 diseases other than scoliosis could account for the contemporary reports. So is finding this scoliosis evidence enough to convince you it's Richard III beyond reasonable doubt? Characteristics of the pelvis indicated the skeleton was that of an adult of slim build. Joe Appleby found the evidence for the sex from the bones was initially not strong, but further analysis convinced her it was a male. Based on a combination of factors, the age range was estimated as 30 to 34 years, and at death, Richard III was 32. So, is finding this age and sex evidence enough to tip the balance for you that the skeleton is that of Richard beyond reasonable doubt? Samples were taken from one of the ribs of the skeleton and carbon-14 dated. 2 independent laboratories gave a radiocarbon date range of 1455 to 1540 with a 95% probability. And remember that he died in 1485, right in the middle of that range. So if you didn't think so before, and adding this radiocarbon evidence, do you now think this is Richard III's skeleton beyond reasonable doubt? Perimortem wounds are those occurring around the time of death, before any healing can occur. 2 wounds to the back of the skull out of 11 in total were judged fatal. 1 certainly instantly fatal, consistent with reports that Richard died on the battlefield. So what's your feeling now? Does adding this evidence of battle wounds convince you this is Richard III beyond reasonable doubt? Now let's have a look at the mitochondrial and Y-chromosome DNA evidence that was investigated. To establish a relationship using mitochondrial DNA, you need an unbroken genealogical chain of women, mother and daughter, down to the last person in the chain, who could be male. Fortunately, genealogy for royalty and the aristocracy is much more readily available than for most of us. In this case, Richard inherited his mitochondrial DNA from his mother, Cicely Neville, who also passed it to her daughter, Anne of York. The paper trail led to 2 people, Canadian Michael Ibsen and Australian Wendy Daldig, who, if the paperwork reflects the biological facts, should have mitochondrial DNA that matches Richard's. The initial analysis showed the skeleton had mitochondrial DNA haplogroup J, but that's found in 12% of the British population and is fairly widespread. But that is the same as the mitochondrial DNA of the 2 living descendants of Anne of York. Further DNA analysis refined J to J1C2C, which is found in just 1.5% of the British population, and that's still a perfect match with Michael Ibsen and Wendy Daldig. Thanks to technological advances in ancient DNA analysis, it was possible to get a more complete analysis of most of the 16,569 bases in the mitochondrial DNA of the skeleton. It showed a perfect match with one of the living cousins, Michael Ibsen, and a 1-step mismatch with Wendy Daldig. This is very uncommon. No other matches were found for this complete a mitochondrial profile in any available databases. But those databases do have limitations. So, is adding this mitochondrial DNA evidence enough to convince you, along with all the rest of the evidence, that this is the skeleton of Richard III beyond reasonable doubt? I have to say that in prior presentations, and indeed in the presentation in Birmingham, this was the stage where most people came on side, saying yes indeed, they believed it was the skeleton of Richard III. The Y chromosome is inherited down the paternal chain, father to son, but Richard had no surviving sons. Following his family tree backward, fortunately well documented, you find his great-great-grandfather, Edward III, had a son, power broker John of Gaunt. Heraldic records, probate records, and many other paper records, the type we typically use in genealogy, show an unbroken chain of sons from John of Gaunt down to 5 descendants through Henry Somerset, 5th Duke of Beaufort. All agreed to take a Y-DNA test. 4 belonged to Y haplogroup R1b U152. But 1 didn't match the other 4. He was haplogroup I M170, which is completely different. But the Y group from the skeleton was GP287, completely different again from all 5 of the Somersets. The Y DNA and paper-based genealogy are in disagreement. Even the simplest 12-marker Y DNA test would have been sufficient to reach that conclusion. So, finally, is finding a skeleton in the Greyfriars Choir with scoliosis of the right age and sex, dating from the right period, with fatal battle wounds and an exact full mitochondrial DNA match, but no Y DNA match, enough to convince you the skeleton is Richard III beyond reasonable doubt. You should have some slightly greater reservations with the Y DNA lack of a match, and that's because this is contrary evidence, and we need to be sure we're not suffering from confirmation bias. What did the professionals think? This is the 2nd of December 2014 paper in the journal Nature, with Terry King as the lead author, documenting the evidence and the conclusions. You can Google the title, it's free online, and it has more than 50 pages of detailed supplemental information. The authors are convinced, concluding the evidence for the remains being those of Richard III is overwhelming. How did they come to that conclusion, and what does it mean? This statement in the Nature article is what really caught my attention and made me think it might be of interest for genealogy. In the first such analysis of its kind, we bring together the genetic and genealogical evidence with non-genetic evidence to come to an overall conclusion about the identity of the skeleton. In family history, we're accustomed to drawing together information from diverse sources, but we do it more by gut feel or experience, if you like. What the Richard III investigation did was systematically consider the strength of the various bits of evidence brought together in a probability framework. Some people shudder at the mere mention of probabilities, but they matter in a very practical way. Here's information I received in an email from Philippa Langley. I'll quote, "The cathedral had confirmed to me that if it was only a 60% chance of it being Richard III, they would place the remains beneath the existing ledger stone in the choir. Whether they would have authorized the costly building alterations that we saw is perhaps doubtful also. The dean at the cathedral also confirmed that only a 90% certainty of identification of it being Richard III would allow her to give him a tomb monument. So let's explore bringing together disparate types of information and evaluate the importance of the DNA evidence. What you do is use a likelihood methodology, widely used in forensic, legal, and health investigations. You weigh the likelihood of each piece of evidence for each of 2 mutually exclusive hypotheses. In this case, the hypotheses are that the skeleton is or isn't Richard III. When you're dealing with evidence that's highly technical, as in the case here, you need experts to make the likelihood estimates. Experts judge the likelihood of finding the type of spinal deformity seen in the skeleton as high if it was Richard, but that the historical reports might be false. Also, the symptoms observed during Richard's life could be due to another disease. Experts judge the likelihood of finding that evidence, if the skeleton was Richard, to be 90%. The likelihood not Richard is the prevalence of scoliosis as severe as in the skeleton in the general population. which was judged to be about 0.4%. The likelihood ratio tells us the experts judge we're 212 times more likely to find this evidence in the skeleton of Richard III than in the population at large, and that's considered strong support. The same types of evaluation were made for the other elements of evidence, but I'll spare you the details. Here are the likelihood ratios for the various pieces of evidence. Ratios greater than 1 and less than 10 provide limited support, between 10 and 100 moderate support, and above 100 strong support. If the likelihood ratio is less than 1, as with the Y-DNA evidence, it weighs against the skeleton being Richard. You combine the evidence by multiplying the likelihood ratios together. The combined likelihood ratio here is 6.7 million. There's an important caveat. The component pieces of evidence must be independent. For example, no combining together likelihoods for the findings from the hypervariable region of the mitochondrial DNA and the complete mitochondrial sequence. Only one likelihood ratio for all the mitochondrial DNA. To calculate the probability the skeleton is Richard, given all the evidence, you need to take into account the original skeptical probability of about 2.5 of Richard's remains being in the location. So what's the result? Maybe the probability of the skeleton being that of King Richard is what, 95%, 99%, 99.9%? Please make up your own mind before we go on to the next slide. What that paper in Nature says is the probability is 99.9994% that the skeleton is Richard. That's odds better than 100,000 to 1 it's him. How convincing is that? There's no widely agreed correspondence between the probability and descriptive terms. In his book Proving History, Richard Carrier suggests equivalence all the way up to virtually certain, but still not certain. As you can see, 99.9994% doesn't quite meet the benchmark for virtually certain. Here's the way the probability the skeleton is Richard III increases as the evidence accumulates in the order we looked at it. I haven't put the initial 2.5% chance in the table, which Carrier classifies as between extremely improbable and very improbable. If you accepted that the skeleton is Richard when the evidence of the scoliosis was found, your criteria for beyond reasonable doubt is 84% or less. When did you judge the probability went beyond reasonable doubt? Adding mitochondrial DNA brought the probability above Richard Carrier's virtually certain benchmark. Adding Y-DNA marginally reduced the probability below that level. Taking the non-genetic evidence alone, the probability is 99.95%, or odds of about 2,000 to 1 it's Richard. Taking just the DNA evidence together, the mismatch of Y-DNA counteracts the excellent match for mitochondrial DNA, giving a 67% probability, or odds of about 2 to 1 it's Richard. So what do we conclude about this statement from the official history? The conclusion here is that DNA provides strong evidence to be assessed alongside all other evidence. It isn't a trump card. In fact, the cathedral would have interred the remains with full honors even without the DNA evidence. Richard III is now out of the car park and laid to rest in this elegant tomb in the peaceful setting of Leicester Cathedral. I hope that I've been able to demonstrate to you the value of the likelihood ratio technique, which certainly isn't limited to this case. If you're interested in looking at this further, you may want to look at an article that I've posted on my website at johndreid.com/confidence, which discusses not only the Richard III case, but also an application of the likelihood ratio technique to an issue in my own genealogy.